Thank you so much, Bella, and thank you, Jon, and thank you, really, all the people who've organised and made this great event happen. I have a little overlap with the things that Sunil said and that Tarun said, but maybe a slightly different emphasis. And perhaps worth mentioning at the start that L.K. Advani, who I've always found a very interesting political figure, even if his star is now waning, he said to me that the book that had influenced him most in his life was How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I said, you know, what and why exactly? And he said particularly the thing that if you prove to somebody that they're wrong in an argument, it doesn't make them agree with you. It often has the opposite of effect, so you have to have a more circuitous route in order to make somebody think in a different way about a political or other issue. So, thinking about the effect or the influence of India upon the world, in a way, a lot of the so-called discovery of India by European countries in the 1960s and 70s, in retrospect, seems a little synthetic. We can look at certain traditions, musical ideas that supposedly emerged from India, and perhaps see them not necessarily as being something that emerged from India, but perhaps emerged more from Europeans visiting India and almost reimagining or reinterpreting what was actually happening. But despite that, the idea that India has had a profound influence on the world is very, very deeply rooted. John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, was in Delhi yesterday, and it was very interesting that in his speech he spoke several times about the magic of India. He spoke about the realignment of US policy towards India. And I suspect in other countries, of course, he would have flattered his hosts, but he wouldn't in the same way have talked about this magic. And although when you analyze and compress that magic, you might say, well, this bit isn't true, or this bit is not as good as you might expect it to be, there is some intangible phenomenon that still appears to emanate from India and attract people from other countries. And I think one of the difficulties now, and this is something that Tarun really spoke about, the idea that there is a kind of stasis or atrophy at the moment in the way that the Indian state in particular works. A few months ago in Delhi, I was at a conference where most of the delegates were coming from semi-official arms of the US system. And what was interesting there was that in the discussion, pretty much everybody agreed, whether it was the Indian delegates, the American delegates, the other foreign delegates, about certain reforms that were necessary, certain changes that were necessary. And there came a point towards the end of the first day when all of the Americans were very enthused, and they said, well, that's great, let's implement all of the things that we've been talking about. You know, there are many people here who are within the Indian bureaucracy. Let's do it. And there was a sort of collective sigh from everybody who was Indian and everybody who was familiar with India, because they knew that that's not how the system works. And so the atrophy within the official system in India is something that I think is almost seems worse now than it has for the last decade, I feel. And without some really fundamental, radical, revolutionary restructuring, it's very hard to see how progress is going to be made except on a personal or individual basis. It's almost as if all the creative activity, whether it's business activity or purely creative activity, seems to come from individuals and private organizations. It does not come in any way through the mechanisms of the state. So I think that you know, one of the very interesting and rather glamorous things about Jawaharlal Nehru was the interest that he had in art, culture, science, design, all these sort of things that were floating around in the rest of the world. And it's amazing the way that these figures like André Malraux or Buckminster Fuller or anybody else seems to cross the front door of both Nehru and Indira Gandhi. There's something extraordinary about that level of interaction, again, which you don't tend to see with political leaders. I mean, I could name a list of political leaders in India now where you can't imagine the equivalent kind of cultural exchange taking place. But I think that the sort of opening out of thought that was occurring at that time was really hugely significant on other countries that were either colonized or were just going through the process of decolonization. I recently looked at the released archives of, I mean, actually Bella briefly referred to this yesterday. They're the archives where torture in British colonies is outlined in some detail. It's essentially secret archives that have now been released 50 years on. But what's really interesting there is that if you look, as I did, for example, at the private papers of Kwame Nkrumah, which were sort of absorbed by the spying system and then replicated into the documentary files, you have these figures like Kwame Nkrumah or like Tom Mboya absolutely looking towards not only Nehru but also to the Indian example for how to imagine being a sovereign independent country. Something that from now seems obvious. Of course, decolonization was going to happen. But if you are in that process of actually emerging out of the chrysalis, if you like, it's very hard to conceive of yourself in a new way. And that was something that India absolutely did and offered an example to other, particularly Asian and African countries. And I also think that the specific Gandhian idea of non-violent protest is something that is ever present even today in a way that we probably take for granted. If you look at the better bits of the Arab Spring, you look at those initial protests in Tahrir Square, or you look at the unarmed people marching up to the fountain in Bahrain, what were they doing? They were taking a gamble that enough unarmed people protesting about something would generate a political effect. You don't know for certain if that's going to work. You don't know if you're going to be gunned down or whether you're going to succeed. But again, it's a conceptual idea, the idea that you can possibly affect political change simply by the power of an unarmed mass movement. And of course, in the case of Gandhi, you can look at people who he took ideas from, but essentially it is seen, I think, as a Gandhian or as an Indian idea. I mean, another interesting aspect to this, of course, is that to some extent, that kind of mass nonviolence is symbiotic or interdependent with state power. In other words, if you were wanting to rise up against the civil war in Syria at the moment, nonviolence wouldn't get you very far. In other words, you work on the assumption that the state will respond to you in a certain way. You think, well, if we march to here, some people might be beaten with sticks, but what they're not going to do is simply kill 1,000 people. And that's a calculation based on the idea that the state operates in a certain way within certain restrictions. And it's a very clever way of thinking. What Gandhi saw was the legalistic nature of British colonial power. And he knew exactly which buttons to press or which levers to pull in order to have the effect that he had. I'm talking really particularly about the 1920s here, or 1920s and 30s. So I'll just check the amount of time. Oh, good, I've got 7 minutes. And then, of course, I think that, as Sunil said, India is an intensely political society. You only have to go to other countries around the world, and you will find that very often you can't have political conversations. I've had this experience in certain Middle Eastern countries. I've had it in Tibet. You try and talk about political ideas. What do you want to happen? How do you perceive your government? People don't have the language to talk about it because the level of suppression is such that you can't operate in that way. Whereas in India, anywhere you go, everywhere you go, people will be talking about politics night and day for 25 hours a day. And again, this is a kind of imagining which has an effect. Let's say for the sake of argument that India was not a democracy. Where would be the big example in Asia? Where would people look to and say, well, clearly democracy can function. Even if a country is huge and people speak lots of different languages, even if it's a multi-party system, it still clearly works. And one of the intriguing things about India is the way that although there is the stasis within the system, within the government, or the government and the civil service and the bureaucracy, the actual functioning of elections is increasingly efficient. The practice of booth capturing or the practice of open corruption in elections gets less and less with every one that happens. And the idea that you can have, I think, it's about 700 million people, Sunil, who vote. Or allowed to vote. I mean, the idea that you can have 700 million people voting, this is something that no other country has or had ever tried before. And again, with hindsight, it's easy to say, well, Of course, the fact that you're illiterate doesn't mean that you can't know what a political leader is offering you and decide how to vote. But many people in 1947 or in 1949-50, when the Indian Constitution came in, thought exactly that. Winston Churchill most famously. He thought that India was simply incapable of operating a democracy. And I think that that is a conceptual change which still today has a lasting effect. So anyway, I've spoken quite positively up until now. And in many ways, I do remain positive about the future kind of influence of India. I tried to think about the economic change and the effect that has on the rest of the world. And although I would agree that essentially with economic power comes cultural power or global political power, I don't think that at the moment there's anything directly affecting the way in which India is perceived by the rest of the world. You can say that the crossover, the aesthetic crossover between India and other countries certainly happens a lot faster. You can see aspects of Indian design or music or film having an impact on the rest of the world. But I would see that as a comparatively superficial thing. You can also, of course, see the transnational people of Indian origin zipping around between Singapore, Chicago, India, London. I mean, that is something that has a definite effect. But it's hard to see it having any kind of, or creating any substantive change in other countries. So perhaps we're in a situation now where India continues to have significant influence. Perhaps India continues to have disproportionate influence. I don't think that a country like China or Indonesia, although in some ways more powerful than India, has that same ability to touch people, to reach people. So it's almost as if there's an expectation that India will be able to influence other countries, and people look to India because perhaps of the events that happened in the mid or late 20th century. And there are moments when it seems that the things that are wrong with India right now, whether it's the injustice of the way that the state often operates, the way in which individuals or families or even communities can so easily be persecuted by the mechanisms of the state, or simply the fact that inequality is so much greater than it used to be. Clearly, economic reform has brought significant benefit not only to an elite, but also to the emerging middle class, but also, for example, in nutrition levels to pretty much everybody. And yet the level of the inequality, or the span of the inequality, it is striking, I think, for anybody who goes to Indian cities. So it's almost as if we're now at a kind of transformative point where India has the ears of the world. People are listening to what India does, and yet there is no clear creative message coming out of India. There isn't, except in its after effects, the Nehruvian or Gandhian vision or the idea of democracy. It's almost as if the world is waiting for whatever the next step is going to be. And at the moment, it's hard to see what that will be. And I think it's quite hard to view it in as positive a light as I would view the earlier period. And one of the most noticeable things is the way that creativity within Indian business, what you could call the Indian business model, and to an extent the family or extended family business model, does appear to be popping up all over the world remarkably quickly. It was no surprise at all to notice over the last few days in Rome that whether it's the waiters serving you pizza, whether it's the fruit juice stalls that look exactly like the ones in Delhi which you see at the corners of roads and bridges, whether it's the people selling roses or petrol or scarves or the kind of tourist trinkets, to find that almost invariably they seem to come from the Indian subcontinent. And my guess is that the reason for that is that they were able to get a better margin than anyone else. So other people were thinking, well, of course you're not really going to make a good living out of selling scarves, but somehow there was a sort of transference of subcontinental ideas of how to do business and how to make sure that you still manage to get the margin even if you're selling something cheaply. So that in a way is something that is disconcerting countries that are perhaps used to certain restrictions and labour laws, for example, which those who are coming particularly newly arrived from the subcontinent wouldn't be so concerned about. So I think wherever you look, the Indian subcontinent is there. It's having its influence in different forms. But the most positive effect really is the one that is beginning to decline but still remains important. And that is a different conceptualization of what you can be as a nation and as a people, the kind of rights that you can have, the mass power of non-violence, and in particular the functioning of democracy in a very, very diverse country. Thank you.